Hey everyone, it's Nick Marzinski at trappinglight.com. In my last tutorial, I talked about the gradient map adjustment layer and how it could be used in Photoshop Elements to create really high contrast black and white images by mapping all of the brightness values within your image to a black and white gradient. However, the problem with using this method, and only this method, is that it allows you to adjust only the overall contrast of the image. It doesn't allow for contrast adjustments of individual elements within your image. Here's what I mean. This is an image that I used in the last tutorial. I started off, if I turn this gradient map off, you can see I started off with 11 bars ranging from pure black at the top to pure white at the bottom. Then I applied a rainbow gradient to it, which you can see up here in the gradient map properties panel, that mapped all of the darker tones to the cooler colors, to the magentas, the blues, and the cyans, while the lighter shades of gray and the whites were mapped to the warmer colors, to the reds, the yellows, and the oranges. Now, just for giggles, let's convert this rainbow gradient that we have here back to black and white just to see what happens. I have in my layers palette another gradient map layer, which is a black to white gradient. So it's going to convert just part of this section of the rainbow gradient back to black and white. As you can see here, I've masked part of it in the layers palette. Now, the conventional thinking is that you'd expect to see the same black to white progression that you have in this original image. However, when I enable this layer, you can see that that's not the case. If you compare the two, this section here, the blacks and the whites and the grays are really all over the place. There's no real clear progression. And the reason for that is that this new black and white gradient map that I've got, that I just applied to my image, is acting on the gradient, on the luminance data of the colors that are right beneath it. Okay, so blue and purple here are your darkest colors, followed by red, and then maybe this magenta up here. It's really kind of all over the place. And the problem with using a gradient map adjustment layer to do a black and white conversion is that it gives you control over the overall luminosity of an image, but it doesn't provide any control over the brightness level of individual colors within your original image. Using this gradient map, I can't affect my blues independently of all of the other colors in the image. Okay, there's just simply no way to do that. And since black and white images depend solely on contrast, because you've stripped all of the color data out, the only thing that's left is contrast. Anything that you can do to get control of that contrast is going to result in a more compelling image. In this case, what I want is the ability to be able to control the brightness of these individual colors that I have in my rainbow gradient. Here's how to do it. What I need to do is I need to add a hue saturation adjustment layer. And to do that, I'm going to go over here to my gradient map. I'm going to control click on the layer mask here, which is going to load that mask section of the layer as a selection. You can see the marching ants right here. Then at the bottom of my layers palette, I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer. And you can see that because I've selected it, it's already masked right to the black and white section of my new conversion. There's a few things that you have to do with this with this hue saturation adjustment layer. The very first thing that you have to do is you have to set its blend mode here to luminosity. What the luminosity blend mode does is it tells Photoshop to ignore any changes that this adjustment layer is going to make to the hue or the saturation of the image, to the color data of the image. Photoshop's only going to pay attention to how this hue saturation adjustment layer adjusts the brightness values of the image. And that's really what we want. We don't care about the hues and the saturation. This is going to end up being a black and white image. But we need to be able to control those luminance values because luminance determines contrast. The other thing I have to do besides changing the blend mode is I have to drag the hue saturation adjustment layer below the gradient map that I used to do the black and white conversion. And this is very important when you think about layer order. Each layer in this layer stack here on the layers palette looks at what's below it in the stack in the order that it appears. If the hue saturation adjustment layer is above this black and white gradient map here, it's going to look down at the gradient map and see an image that's already been converted to black and white. So it's not going to have any control over the colors. By dragging it below the black and white gradient map, the hue saturation adjustment is going to see the colors in that original rainbow gradient, and it'll be able to affect them. Now, with this in the hue saturation adjustment layer, with the drop down here selected to master, any changes I make to lightness are global. I can drag it all the way to the left to turn it completely black. I can drag it all the way to the right to turn it completely white. However, if I drop it down and select an individual color, let's say blue, now when I change this lightness slider, it's only going to affect the blues over here, and none of the other color tones in the image are going to get affected. The other thing that it's important to notice, let's say I want to darken these down a little bit. The other thing that's important to notice is that it affects all of the blues. It affects this dark blue here as well as this cyan blue and this purple that has some blue data. If I want to separate those, that's as easy as changing the hue slider. Again, what the hue slider is doing, since the layer mode is set to luminosity, it's affecting only the brightness of the hues. And so by changing the hues, what you're doing is you're actually changing the brightness of these individual colors that are already there. You're not actually changing the hue. But that allows us a much greater degree of control over shades of the same color. Okay, and by going around to the various colors, I can get pretty close to my original gradient that I had within the image here. And there we go. That's probably about as close as I can quickly get, but it's a lot better than what I had here with the blacks and the whites and the grays really all over the place. By adding the hue saturation layer, I have a greater degree of control over how the blacks and the whites and the grays appear in my image. Now I'm going to go back to the photograph that I used in the last tutorial. I'm going to get this out of here. Here what I had, again, is a black and white conversion simply using a black to white gradient that you can see up here in the properties panel. Now again, I don't really have any control over individual colors simply using this gradient map. I can affect brightness on a global scale, but individual color data I have no control over. So in order to get control over that color data, what I'm going to do again is add a hue saturation adjustment layer, change the blend mode to luminosity, drag it below my gradient map. And now I can affect the individual colors by changing the hue saturation stuff that I have here. For example, I know that down here on the trail most of the color is in the red channel. So if I select reds and then drag the brightness down, you can see that, and by changing the hue, I can exert a little bit more control over it. You can see that what I'm doing is I'm affecting only the brightness of the trail at the bottom without changing anything else in the image. In the same way, if I want to affect the trees here, even though they're green in my original image, most of that data is actually in the yellows. I can go to yellows and I can brighten the leaves on the trees without changing the rest of the tones in my image. So this gives me a much greater degree of control over contrast than I get using the gradient map adjustment layer alone. It's really the best of both worlds. I get the high contrast from the gradient map that converts it to black and white, with the ability to then selectively adjust contrast in the colors with the hue saturation adjustment layer. Here's one last tip I have if you're going to use this method. What you should do is you should group the two adjustment layers that you've added. In order to do that, select both of them by holding down the Shift key when you click on them, and then drag them down to this folder icon right here at the bottom of the Layers palette. What that does is it groups both of these adjustment layers into a single group, really. And there's two advantages to this. The first advantage, well, three really. The first advantage is that if I click on the eyeball icon, I can turn both the gradient map and the hue saturation adjustment layer on and off. I don't have to worry about clicking on each of these layers individually to turn them on and off. I can do it globally by simply clicking on the group eye icon. I can also adjust the opacity. Yes, I'm aware there's a performance alert. I can also adjust the opacity of both of them by adjusting the opacity of the group. The final thing that I can do is I can also apply a layer mask to the group. And when I get my brush and paint on the layer mask with black to hide things, it's acting on both the gradient map and the hue saturation adjustment layer. So I'm actually painting back in my original color image without having to paint masks on both of these adjustment layers. I can simply just paint on this group mask and it affects both of those layers the same way as it would if I painted on the layer mask of each individual adjustment layer. So that's a really handy way to be able to not only control your black and white conversion and your contrast, but also group both of those into a single layer that then you can make changes to without having to make changes to each of the adjustment layers individually. So that's it for now. Hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. Hope that you got something out of it. My name again is Nick Marzinski with TrappingLight.com. Have a great weekend, everyone.